So if you're in tech, the odds of you hearing the term OKR is actually pretty high. Objectives and key results, or OKRs in short, it's basically a framework that's been adopted by top tech companies in the Silicon Valley and beyond, and especially effective for dealing with uncertainty, in an innovative work setting where you're focusing on the outcomes and not just like the outputs. Now, today I'm going to be talking with Felipe Castro. Felipe is actually one of the leading global OKR thought leaders and trainers, and also described by Marty Kagan as one of his six favorite thinkers about product. Now, as an OKR trainer, Felipe has trained thousands of individuals and also helped some of the world's leading tech companies become more adaptive and focused. Now, we will dive deep today, guys, into OKRs and actually how they can help take your products to the next level. We talked about the most important factors to setting these objectives and key results with examples. We'll also discuss how to balance between these moonshots and roof shots when you're setting these OKRs, and also the environments where the OKRs actually are most effective. So get ready, guys, for today's talk on all about OKRs with Felipe Castro. Hey, I'm your host, Cyrus Slayman, and welcome to PM Hub Podcast, a show dedicated to bringing you fresh and unique insights from product leaders and tech entrepreneurs. Hey, Philip, welcome to PM Hub.
Thanks, Cyrus. Thanks for having me.
No, it's great for sure. So let's talk about OKRs today, Philippe. Now, tell us first of all, tell us about where does it come from? This whole OKR, what's the origin?
OKR is basically an agile, interactive approach to goal setting, for setting alignment and priorities. Was created in Silicon Valley. Um, the first company to start using the original concept was Intel, but it was really took off when Google adopted it the very first year of operations. And actually, Intel didn't even use the term OKR. So OKR is a crowdsourced uh, approach, which is part of its power because it was created by practitioners. Right? It's basically evolved in Silicon Valley from company to company, and it's used by most of the high performance technology companies today.
Very cool. Now, why would you think OKRs are becoming increasingly more popular? What edge does it give it to the organization?
First of all, since OKR was created and evolved in Silicon Valley, it was created to deal with uncertainty and innovation, right? So it was not while some of the traditional approaches to planning and goal setting, they were created to industries with very long investment cycles, like I don't know steel or mining, right? With 5-year, 10-year planning cycles. OKR was created to deal with high growth companies, Intel to speak, Google, right? So it was created to deal with uncertainty, innovation, and autonomous teams. So that's the core of what many organizations are looking for today, to be more agile, more dynamic, more innovative. So it fits very well with the needs of a company that wants to compete in the 21st century.
Yeah, for sure. Especially during COVID times, I've noticed, you mentioned, dealing with uncertainty. I've noticed a lot of my previous guests talking about switching to OKRs just because they're not sure what's going to happen, right? So that's a great point.
Oh yeah, definitely. COVID was a major boost to OKR, of course, because suddenly everybody agrees, yeah, we can't plan. So
Right.
now everybody understands we don't have a crystal ball, nobody can predict the future. So it was definitely a push to OKR adoption. Yeah.
For sure. So, what would you say from your own experience, Philip? What would you say is the least understood about OKRs?
The least understood about OKRs is that people believe that can use OKR without changing the way they work. I call this the Tinkerbell approach to OKR, where basically you sprinkle some OKR fairy dust on top of a traditional company, and it magically turns into Google. Right? Of course, that doesn't work. OKR comes from a radically different culture, a radically different model, and it's part of the overall Silicon Valley model, right? And it fits the where each part fits and builds on each other. And you can't simply take something that was created in a very different model and believe it will fit in a traditional company using traditional management and traditional practices. So that's by far is the least understood dimension or concept around OKR, because an OKR is very easy to consume, it's very hard to produce. So sometimes people see a well-written OKR, hey, that's easy, but it's just like reading a well-written book. Yeah, very easy to read, very, very hard to write. So I guess that the least understood concept around OKR is that it's totally different and requires a completely different mindset and approaches from the traditional companies. And it actually requires unlearning lots of the old models and mindsets. And that's something that people don't realize.
For sure, yeah. That's such a good point you're bringing up, practices versus processes, right? You can certainly adopt the how-tos, or the processes, let's say, but then the practices and the way you work and the mindset is actually what makes a difference, right? That's a great point.
Yeah, definitely. Anyone can suddenly call every team is now called a squad. That doesn't mean they are suddenly Spotify, right? So it's
True.
something very similar happens to OKR. Hey, we're using OKR. Yeah, we'll see.
That's a great point. So now breaking the OKRs, the acronym into objectives and key results, right? What are the most important keys to effective team objectives in your opinion?
Okay. Yeah, the way to create good OKRs for teams or for product teams is, first of all, is the idea that you're not giving them a solution to build, not giving them a feature to build. We're giving them a problem to solve or an opportunity to work on, right? So instead of giving them a specific implementation to work on, right, to build, you're giving them a business need or a customer need to work on. That's the crucial distinction, right? And it starts by giving them an objective that actually describes what you want to improve, and actually discussing that problem with them, and discussing again. There's a lot of big conversation between managers and teams around, hey, what's the best objective for what we want to achieve? What are the key results to actually measure if you want to achieve? So the best way to understand it is the objective describes what you want to improve. The key results are how you measure if you're actually getting there, if you're actually improving something, right? So it's more, you have to focus around the outcomes you want to achieve. And in OKR, outcome has a very precise meaning, which is the measurable benefits for your customers, for your organization, or for your employees. So what are those measurable benefits you want to produce? That's the big question. And that's the conversation you have with the teams, right? So again, the objective describes what you want to improve, and the results are how we measure if you're actually working, if you're actually succeeding in doing that.
Sure. Now, you touched upon it a little bit, but who should be involved in selecting which objectives to work on for each quarter?
Yeah. The main thing is it has to come from strategy, right? So it starts with having both a company strategy and product strategy, and understanding, hey, what's the most important thing we need to do based on the insights, based on the evidence. So it starts with the strategy, right? Then based with the strategy, then you give a team a problem to solve, and then there's a conversation, right? So the why comes from from leadership. I mean, why are we doing this? Why is this important? The what benefit do we want to achieve? How are we going to measure it? Comes from is it in a conversation between the leaders and the teams, and the how. What are the ideas we're going to test? What are the hypotheses? It's up for the team. The team has the autonomy to test different ideas, different solutions. So usually, deciding who needs to be involved is leadership comes with the strategy, and then there's a conversation between leadership and all the members of the team to discuss, hey, what's the real objective, what we want to achieve. So John Cutler describes in a way that I like that, which is the leader or manager sits down with the team and says, hey, this is my mental model. This is the way I'm thinking about it. Now let's try to poke holes on my mental model to see if it stands, right? So you have a conversation, right? So you explain to the team the customer problem. You explain the business strategy. You explain the main metrics. Explaining the context is crucial, right? And then you have a conversation about, okay, what are we going to measure here? What are the best results we can have? what's the best way to describe that objective, right? So that type of conversation is crucial, right? And it includes explaining the context.
Hmm. Very cool. So now, talking about the level of ambition for each of the objectives, Philip, how do you balance between ambition, very ambitious ones, like, called like moonshots, and the conservative objectives, like the roof shots, when setting objectives?
Yeah, first of all, there's a very one of the things that one of the misunderstandings of OKR that every single key result has to be aspirational and very, very ambitious, which is not true, right? Setting aspirational targets or moonshots, it's very, very hard. It's probably the hardest component of OKR because it requires a complete different mindset. It requires a different mental model, it requires different compensation. It's very, very hard to put it in practice. So I usually strongly recommend that people start with uh, regular targets, roof shots, things that are hard but predictable, right? Hard but achievable. And then over time, you can start setting more and more ambitious OKRs. So
Hmm.
usually the idea is learn first. It's a journey. So start things that are more predictable. And then over time, you can start experimenting with more and more aspirational, more and more ambitious OKRs. So in a single OKR, you can have, for example, two key results that are regular, like roof shots. You can have one thing, oh, this one thing is really hard. This one thing is very, very ambitious. Right? That's one way to put it. Because if you think about it, the idea of let's try to do four very hard things at the same time during the same quarter is not a very good idea. Right? It doesn't make much
Hmm.
sense, right? And it's probably
Hmm.
a sign of lack of focus. Oh, I want to try four very hard things at the same time. Right? Usually, you should try to do like one. Let's try one very hard thing. Maybe that makes sense, right? So um, definitely thinking about that balance is important, right? And it's also for teams that are ready or mature enough to have a great relationship with managers. The environment is very important because otherwise it's just there are several issues that can be created by using moonshots. So I would definitely take baby steps towards setting
Hmm.
more ambitious targets.
Like what you hear so far, make sure to never miss an episode by clicking on the subscribe button now. This podcast has been made possible by listeners like yourself, and I'm thankful for your support. Now, let's get back to the show. Very cool. Now, talking about, the objectives and like, the difficulty of them, like, can you assign the same objective to multiple teams or vice versa?
Yeah, you can have actually the concept of shared OKRs, where two or more teams share the same OKR. It's very, very common, right? It's very, very important. Um, because depending on the team topology, you need more than one team to work together to create, to test different ideas until they find a solution that works, right? So the idea of a shared OKR is that two teams or more, they share the same OKR, the same objective and the same key results, and each one has different activities. So each one is going to do different things, but they're working together to move the needle on those key results. So definitely you can share an OKR, right? What you can do is you can take also a high-level problem or opportunity. You can slice it, break it down into components. Right? You can decompose that high-level, say, key result into parts and give a slice to each team, right? So, for example, let's say you want to increase, I don't know, engagement or usage of this thing. You can break it down into different parts of the product, and each team has one component that contributes to that high level thing, for example, right? Say
Mhm.
we want to reduce the user complaints. And you can say, oh, we're reducing complaints about this part of the product, this part, that other part of the product, that other part of the product, for example, right? So you can so slicing a higher level key result into parts is one of the easiest ways to uh, take a take on a large problem and have several different teams working on that very large high level problem.
Right. Now, in such a case, when you have, like you said, multiple teams working on the same big problem, how do you attribute like progress for each of those teams working on it?
Yeah, the easy way is to break it down slice it into different components so it's easier to measure. So, for example, let's say you want to reduce, say, user complaints, right?
Hmm.
Or support calls. Somebody has to call you because and then you can say, oh, support calls due to that feature, calls due to Android app, calls due to iOS app, support calls due to, I don't know, billing, support calls due to. So you take a high level number of support calls, for example,
Hmm.
and you break it down into different components, and you assign each of those components to different teams. That's the easier way to attribute, right? Another way
Yeah.
to do attribution is by doing an A/B test, right? And then
Hmm.
teams that are more experienced with experiments, they actually are pretty good at doing that, and they can just do an A/B test and compare users that are exposed to their new solution and contrast to
Hmm.
the rest, the control group, and actually by doing that they can do attribution. Right? So the two most common ways are either slicing into components or doing A/B test or something similar.
Right on, right on. Now you gave us, a few examples, but if you were to really, really, drive it home and kind of like nail it, what are some examples of like some good objectives, and also some of the examples like actually like the bad objectives in your opinion?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the first thing is the first tip I usually give is if you have to stop to take a breath while reading the objective, you're doing it wrong, right? Because sometimes people write very long objectives, right? Like several sentences in an objective, and you have to actually stop to catch your breath while you're reading the objective. So that's a terrible sign. Right?
Hmm.
So a good objective describes a problem or opportunity in a concise and engaging way. So that's the concept of great objective, right? Describes a problem or opportunity in a concise and engaging way. So, for example, Google has a really good one from 2008. Make the web as fast as flipping through a magazine. That's something that is short, it's engaging, it's a problem. How do you make the web faster, right? But instead of simply saying, "Hey, make the web faster," making the web make the web as fast as flipping through a magazine. He adds that engaging component, right? Because in OKRs, they actually don't have to be boring, right? So making them more compelling, more motivation, more engaging is a good practice in OKR, right? So they can be as simple as um, delight our customers, right? Or, for example, there's another one, an engineering team I worked in the past. They wrote one which was party like is 99.99% of time, right? So what they did was they took something like I don't know, world class availability, which is boring as hell, and turned it into something that's fun and memorable, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, instead of right. So you can't let teams do that, right? What's very important is that being clear is mandatory. Being creative and fun is optional. So if you write a joke on a OKR and nobody gets it, rewrite the joke, right? So uh, an objective that nobody gets, nobody understands, is useless. So it's better to write something like improve availability, which is not a very engaging, but at least it's clear, than writing something that is fun but it's totally impossible for anyone to understand. Right? So, but it starts by giving people a problem or opportunity, right? So it's not about launching a new feature, but why are we launching a new feature? Right? What are we trying to achieve with it? What's the benefit, right? And that's why a small change that we can make is when you start describing that the objective is about what we want to improve. Just that single word, improve, makes it a little bit harder to think about launching a feature, right? Because I
Hmm.
want to improve something, so it's not about launching 10 features anymore, right? And it's definitely not about launching, I don't know, or 20 points, story points, right? Because it's not actually improving anyone's life, right? So that focusing on the benefits, the outcomes you want to achieve, that's the core conversation that needs to happen to write a great OKR.
Very cool. Now, we talked about the objective piece of the OKR and how it's the kind of responsibility of the leadership to come up with those. Now, moving on to the key results part of the OKRs. Now, who is in charge of coming up with these key results?
Yeah, I would like to rephrase that. Leadership, they don't have to create with the objective. They come up with the problem to solve or the opportunity. That comes from the strategy. The actually wording of the objective can and should come from the teams, because writing the objective itself is an exercise that will help engage the team, right? So again, I can tell you, yeah, let's imagine I'm the manager. I can tell you, okay, we need to improve availability, and then you can come up with engaging objectives like party like is 99.99% uptime, for example, right?
I see.
So I can tell you make the web faster, and you can come up write something like make the web as fast as flipping to a magazine, right? So the problem to solve or the opportunity comes from the leadership, right? And then the objective can be written together with both squads, both the team members and leadership, for example, right? But even the problem to solve itself, it's worthy of having a conversation, right? That idea from John Cutler, try to poke holes on my mental model. Because sometimes the problem can be wrong, the objective can be wrong. So having that openness, that dialogue is important. And asking, is this the real problem we're trying to solve? Because sometimes the strategy is correct, but the way we're describing the problem is not very precise, for example. So having that conversation is crucial, and that openness for debate and dialogue is very, very important.
Hmm.
And then coming for the key results, sometimes when the problem is a known one, right? Hey, uptime. Yeah, you want to improve availability. Yeah, we're talking about uptime, right? So just like 2 or 3 metrics we're talking about. So sometimes the key results are very, very clear. It's almost a given, right? And that's fine. But more often than not, what happens is you're working on something that is new, and when you're working on a new problem, almost by definition, you have never measured it before because it's new, right? And
Yeah.
defining, creating the key results themselves is a big part of the problem, right? So having that conversation is crucial to engage the teams, because unless they understand the key results, they will never be able to test different ideas to move them. If I don't understand a metric, how can I contribute to it? It's impossible, right? So the idea is usually the leaders come up with the problem to solve, the opportunity, or another way to describe it. Sometimes they come up with a benefit, like, oh, we need to make the life of the customer simpler while doing this task here in our product. Make it simpler. There's several different ways to measure what's simpler, right? So sometimes they come up with a problem, and then the team works together with leaders to, hey, what are the key results? How are we going to measure it? Right? And then there's a conversation, and that again, that's crucial for engaging the teams and ensuring they actually understand the key results.
I see. Now, it's very interesting you put it that way, Philip. Now, you mentioned that, even the problem or the benefit that comes from the leadership, they should open it up to the team to kind of like, hey, poke a hole in it, something like that. Now, would you say they should open it to the whole team, or maybe just like the kind of product manager or product designer or tech lead, or like the whole engineering team? Like how what's the spectrum of like this concept of like putting it up there for challenge?
It's always the whole team. It doesn't mean everybody will engage, right? So it's everybody. It's always everybody can participate if they want to, right? Uh, Sometimes one engineer doesn't want to engage that much. It's totally fine, but usually you'd be surprised of how much people actually engage when they actually start understanding the metrics, understanding things. I remember a few years ago as I was working with a fintech startup, uh, and I remember a product manager telling me, I spent the last 2 years trying to get my engineers, the engineers that work with me, to actually read the support tickets, right? because we have our customers asking for help and they never read it, never. Now they created a key result which is to reduce the support tickets, and they are reading every single one of them without me telling them to do that, because
Nice.
they realize it's important for them. They decided it's important for them, so they want to do it, right? And we have lots and lots of research on goals that shows that whenever people are part of creating the goal, their engagement is way higher. The engagement goes way up. So that's why setting the metrics, setting the key results is a core part of the role of the team. And again, preferably everyone in the team can engage and will engage. Eventually, someone will be less engaged, and that's just fine. And over time, that can change, and people can usually become more and more engaged as the more they see the value of it.
Yeah. It's a sense of ownership that they have over the problem,
Yeah,
right? That's right.
exactly.
That's
And
right.
again, with the same problem, reading the turbo ticket. The moment they decided it's important for us, they started doing it, right? Because so that ownership, we
Yeah.
selected that. It's not something that was imposed to us, not something that came top down, whatever. We decided it's important, so we own it.
Right. No, I love that. So what are, we would say the most factors, the most actually important factors when defining key results in your opinion?
Okay. Yeah, the first one is key result has to be measurable, right? So there's a formula that comes from Intel, right, which is called the
Mhm.
the so what, sorry, the as measured by formula. The idea is to write a good OKR, you have to say what you want to improve and also how you're going to measure it. So it's I will improve dot 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 as measured by dot dot dot, right? So the idea is I will improve your objective and as measured by a set of key results. So the role of a set of key results is actually to decide how you're going to measure if you're being successful, right? So the very first thing is that a key result has to be measurable. Very first thing. So qualitative key results is the dumbest idea you can have in OKR because it doesn't make any sense because it's is lack of understanding of the core concepts of OKR, right? So
Mhm.
don't do qualitative key results. Uh, all key results have to have a number. Very, very basic. So this is a great advice from Marissa Mayer, used to be VP of product from Google, the first female engineer from Google. It has to have a number. Uh, first thing. And a good key result measures an outcome, meaning a benefit, either for your customers or for a company, right? So I usually say that a key result has to pass the so what test, meaning you present an OKR and, for example, launch a new app. So what? What's the benefit? What's the outcome? Or somebody presents a key result such as create an engagement program. So what? We don't want a program. We want higher engagement. So let's measure that, right? So a good result has to be measurable, has to have a number, it has to pass the SOA test, meaning it measures uh, a measurable benefit, it's an outcome for the customer or for the company, right?
Mhm.
And a less obvious criteria is that a key result means you have to know where you're going to get the data from. Because sometimes people do what I call magic measurement, where
Mhm.
they say, oh, we're going to improve the cultural fit from X to Y. I say, okay, how are you going to measure cultural fit? Oh, we don't know. so, so unless you know where you're going to get the data from, you don't have a key result yet, right? So
Right.
this is a trickier, uh, and this is, I would say, a little bit more sophisticated mistake, but it happens a lot.
Right. Yeah. That's such a good point, especially the last one. And like actually you have to make sure you can measure it. It's actually
Yeah,
it's possible,
being
right?
measured. Yeah, being measurable in theory doesn't count, right? Or
Mhm.
someone else can measure it doesn't count.
Right. Now, on the one that you mentioned, it has to be a number. I'm assuming you're talking about like a ratio or percentage. It can't be an absolute number, right?
Oh, yeah, it can. It can be increasing for, I don't know, for 10 to 25. Yeah, it can be a number. Increase
Hmm.
sales from actual, yeah, it doesn't have to be a percentage. It depends
Oh,
on
okay.
the what are you measuring, right?
Depends on what measure.
Um, remember we're talking about support tickets or trouble
Hmm.
tickets could be reduced customer complaints from X to Y. It can be absolute numbers. Reducing trouble tickets from X to Y, for example. It doesn't have to be a percentage or a ratio necessarily. Depends on if it's a high growth company, if the baseline is changing, maybe a ratio is a better one, but doesn't necessarily has to be a ratio. It depends.
I see. I see. Very cool. Now, how often do you recommend, tracking these OKRs, Philippe?
Yeah, that's another usual common misconception. Um, an OKR, we usually plan OKRs every quarter, but you track them every week, usually,
Mm,
right? Because the whole point of OKR is that you are course correcting as you go throughout the quarter, right? And the analogy I usually use is imagine you're using your GPS, I don't know, Waze or Google Maps, and it told you, say, once a year, hey, you took a wrong left turn like in January, and you've been going the wrong direction for 11 months now, right? So the idea is you want your GPS to be almost to be real time, and you want your OKS to be almost real time, if possible, right? So the idea is you're measuring every week and you're course correcting, meaning you're adjusting your backlog, you're testing different ideas, right, based on what's working and what's not working. By far, the most common approach is to do the OKR checking every week. A few squads choose to do it every other week, like twice a month. That's fine too.
right. Right, very cool. Now, if you want to give us maybe you gave us like maybe a few examples here and then, but are there any other examples you want to give us on like on good key results that teams could define?
Yeah, the first of all, one good approach is to try to measure the changes in behaviors from your customers, right? So, meaning, are they recommending more user engagement? Are they using your feature? Are they recommending to others? Are they buying more? Are we reducing the rate of cancellation, the rate of churn? Those all could be good key results, right? Because
Mhm.
sometimes I work with teams that are either so detached from the actual customer problem that they are either only used to doing, say, engineering metrics, oh, percent test coverage, or median time to repair, or uptime, or they basically do surveys. Oh, we do satisfaction surveys over and over and over again because they don't realize they can actually measure how people are actually using the product. So something that is very common is to measure the behaviors using the product. Yeah, more say maybe something as simple as active users, monthly active users for a given part of the product, number of people that actually create a report and share it. Right? So measuring those user behaviors is a great example. Can be a great example of key results.
Hmm. Very cool. Thanks for sharing. Now, uh, does the size of the company, or let's say business model, B2B or B2C, or even industry affect, how effective our OKRs are for them?
No, it's more. I wouldn't say industry or. It's more if it's. Remember when we started talking at the beginning about the Tinkerbell approach, right? And that OKR comes
Right.
from a very different model. The closer you are to, say, the Silicon Valley approach or the Silicon Valley culture and practices, the easier it is to adopt OKR, right?
Hmm.
So, say industry, yeah, we are in banking. Yeah, if you're talking about a fintech and a digital bank, yeah, it's probably way closer to the Silicon Valley model. It's easier and easier to adopt OKR than versus a traditional bank, which is usually way harder to adopt OKR. So it's not usually about industry or business model. Uh, it's usually more about if you're closer to a more traditional culture and practices than anything else, right? Size definitely it doesn't affect effectiveness of OKR, but it can make it harder because as you scale, um, aligning can be harder and harder depending on the structure, right? That definitely can be an issue. You also mentioned B2B, B2C. Usually B2C is things that tend to be easier to measure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or another aspect could be anything that has longer feedback loops, like hardware, tends to be, because of the longer loops, they tend to be a little bit tricky to use OKR, but it's still doable, right?
Mm.
Because we have several companies that do hardware that are experimenting fast these days, so it's um, that's not an excuse to not using OKR. It just, of course, it's harder than a SaaS company, for example.
Right, right. So, and when would you recommend basically not using OKRs? Now, you kind of like touched upon it a little bit, but I'm curious to know, like, explicitly, what are like situations when actually you don't recommend using OKRs?
Whenever you want to simply tell teams what to do, if you want to simply use OKR just to say, hey, I want those features, you don't need OKR. A backlog is way better than that. I usually say if it fits Jira, it's not a key result, right? If you can
Yeah.
put it on Jira, it's not a key result, right?
Mm.
So if you basically want to make a copy of your backlog, why do you need OKR? Right? You don't need it. So that's definitely when not using OKR. And that includes, oh, we don't want to change. We want to remain using it. We just want to say we use OKR. Yeah, that's usually a failure. There's a true story from a very large bank where they had a dashboard, right?
Hmm.
And it was the same dashboard for years. And then from one meeting to the next, they changed the label to OKR. And then the CIO got in the room, hey, those are our OKRs. The exact same dashboard they had like the week before, right? So,
Yeah.
true story. But that's not what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so definitely don't use OKR in that scenario.
Sure. I can even say from my own experience, I've been in teams where, they call it like daily scrums, and there's nothing scrum about that model. It's like pure waterfall, but just they call it scrum for the sake of calling it scrum. I kind of feel like it's more fashionable.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's definitely OKR in name only. That's a very very common issue, and definitely that doesn't add any value. We only frustrate people at the end because it will fail.
Yeah, for sure. Now, from your experience, I was wondering if you can give us a few examples of, doing OKRs basically have gone wrong, basically, not meeting the purpose.
Yeah, it's usually first of all this type of company that doesn't want to change, right? For example, once I worked with CPG company, consumer packaging goods company, in the past several years ago. And first of all, the CEO said, "Yeah, we want to do it. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, let's do OKR." And we did a workshop with all the C suite and the direct reports, and we had all the direct reports writing OKRs, and they're really good, etc. And then a couple weeks later, I got a call from the company. Yeah, we kind of going, we kind of going to go back to the way we were before, and we're going just to give some projects to them to work on. I say, why? Oh, they're not able to write OKRs, but they just shown you that they wrote OKRs. You approved their OKRs.
Mm.
Yeah, but we want to give them projects anyway. So that's definitely an example of OKR gone wrong, right? Sometimes people don't want to measure it. Sometimes people don't want to track them. Sometimes um, there's a romantic view of OKR, where just by adopting it and without tracking it, it's magic, right? And
Right.
actually, OKR requires a lot of discipline because you have to track them every week. You have to run experiments, collect evidence, and then make decisions based on evidence. It's a lot of discipline, right? And a lot of and so and sometimes people don't want to do it, right? They lack the discipline to do it. They want to just do the fun part of OKR without actually doing the hard work. So that's definitely something that gone wrong. And I always say that the first most important success factor in any OKR adoption is that senior leaders, they have to show commitment and consistency. They have to show commitment because it's a journey. You won't get OKR right the first time. So you always like developing different muscles and evolving over time. And you have to
Mhm.
show consistency because you have to change the way you do one-on-ones, the way you do town halls, the way you do reports. Everything has to be aligned around that new language, which is OKR. So OKR creates a shared language to allow people to talk about priorities, right? And
Mhm.
everyone has to use that same language. So I have several examples where either the senior leaders didn't want to do it, they lacked the discipline, or sometimes senior leaders say, "Yeah, no, Cyrus, yeah, you can use OKR, of course." And you said, "Okay, how about you, boss?" "No, that's not for me. That's just for you teams. We don't need that. We don't need that." And of course, that doesn't work. Of course.
Yeah. I remember from this saying that says, there was this funny picture of it showing who wants change, and everybody in the room kind of like raised their hand. And now they asked who wants to change, and nobody raised their hands because.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. I want other people to change. I want magically to change. And the fact
Right.
is, we discussed in the beginning, there's a lot of unlearning going on. Right?
Hmm.
So one of the provocations I usually do with executives is they often tell me, "Yeah, we want to be a data-driven company." I say, "Yeah, oh, fine, huh? That's cool." So you know that when you are a data-driven company, you can say, "I have 20 years of experience in this industry," because that doesn't count anymore. You have to actually show the evidence. We don't actually care much about your experience.
Yeah.
And then they actually are, "Oh my gosh, I guess you're right." So I'm not saying that 20 years of experience is totally irrelevant, right? But all of your years of experience will basically allow you to create some ideas that need to be tested just like any other ideas. They are as likely to work or not as any other ideas, right? So this is something that can take a while to unlearn. So I keep going back to that concept of unlearning. Right? And Barry
Hmm.
O'Reilly has a great book on the topic called Unlearn, which I always mention because it's a core part of um, adopting OKR. You have to unlearn the old model. That's crucial.
Very cool. I'll make sure to put a link of the book on Learn in the description for our listeners. Thanks for sharing that. Cool. So, I mean, Felipe, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Now, where can our listeners, learn more about the work that you do?
Yeah. Just go to my website, felipecastro.com. We can include a link so people can know how to spell it.
Yeah, sure.
But just go to my website. There's a ton of free material on OKR. I also do a newsletter. So there's a ton of OKR material on my website.
Very cool. Well, Philippe, thank you so much for being on the PM Hub podcast show and talking about OKRs.
Thanks a lot for having me, Cyrus.
That's it for this week's episode of PM Hub Podcast, guys. Now, if you enjoyed this episode on the show, feel free to share it with your network on your social media and consider leaving a 5-star review so we can actually reach more audience. If you have any suggestions, recommendations, please feel free to send it over to me on my email at cyrus@productmanagerhub.org, or you can just find me on social media. I'm all over the place, and I can just let me know. Now you can get all the tips and action items of this episode for free at this bit.ly link that I'm going to give you. Is bit.ly/PMHub15. Also subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you'll never miss any of the future episodes. I'm Cyrus Slayman, and until next show, stay safe and healthy.